Our guest this evening, Rashid Khalidi, is a professor of modern Arab studies at Columbia University. He is, in fact, a native New Yorker with degrees from Yale and Oxford. And before Columbia, where he's been for nearly 10 years, he spent 8 years teaching at the University of Chicago. He was a neighbor and friend of Barack Obama at that time. And he's written several books on the Middle East and has spoken at Politics and Prose at least a couple of times before. His latest book, Brokers of Deceit, is a critical appraisal of the U.S. role in trying to mediate the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And you can tell from the book's subtitle how the U.S. has undermined peace in the Middle East, that Rashid doesn't think the Americans have helped, but have in fact hindered the process. He accuses a succession of U.S. administrations going back decades of professing to be honest brokers, laboring to bring the two sides together, while actually working in lopsided fashion to favor Israel's interests at the expense of the Palestinians. Rashid contends that with only a few Cold War exceptions, U.S. actions have consistently been driven by domestic political considerations, effective Israeli lobbying, the quiet acquiescence of Arab Gulf states, and a disregard for the true welfare of Palestinians. Now, it's a safe bet that many in Washington, and I'd even venture to say maybe a few here, have a different perspective on some of this history than Rashid has, but others no doubt agree. In any case, that's the great thing about these gatherings at Politics and Prose. We at least can meet in peace, show respect for one another's views, and engage in meaningful and courteous dialogue. And let me note that Rashid argues his case not just as an academic, but as someone who was personally involved in at least some of the diplomacy he writes about. In the early 1990s, he served as an advisor to the Palestinian delegation in the negotiations with Israel that followed the 1991 Madrid Peace Conference. Rashid plans to speak for a little bit, and then he'll certainly leave time for questions. If you have a question, please come up to one of the two microphones at the front. There's one there, and there's one over there, because we are recording and videoing this event in order to be able to post it online. Afterward, Rashid will be happy to stay and sign copies of his book, and will also help our staff, if you could remember, to fold up the seats that you're sitting in and lean them against something more or less solid. Anyway, if you haven't already, please silence your cell phones and join me in welcoming Rashid Khalidi.
I love coming to this bookstore. This is, I think, the third time that I've been here. And I think bookstores are one of the greatest things on earth. And I am so happy that there are successful independent bookstores like this one. And it's thanks to people like you that this place is thriving, and I'm very pleased about that. I lived in Chicago for 15 years, actually, from 1987 until 2003, at which time then State Senator Obama had not even announced for U.S. Senate. So all of that is true. We did know each other, but he was not then what he has become since. So I'm going to talk for, I think I'll try and talk for less than 30 minutes. I do tend to go on, I'm sorry, but this is a complicated story, and it's a little bit different than the story many people believe and understand. So bear with me, and there'll be time, hopefully, for some questions afterwards. In preparation for the Madrid Peace Conference, at which I participated as an advisor to the Palestinian delegation in 1991, the United States sent letters of assurances to all the parties, Palestinians included. The letter to the Palestinians promised opposition to actions that were prejudicial or precedential in negotiations, such as Israeli settlement activity. That was a promise, by the way, that was never kept. The letter also promised that, and I quote the letter of assurances, the United States will act as an honest broker. Similarly, during Palestinian-Israeli negotiations that took place here in Washington in 2008, Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice told the Palestinian delegation she wanted to meet with them privately. I'm quoting documents that are actually available online. I cite them in the book. So I can tell you what I think of your positions without hurting my role as the honest broker. So here we have a document from 1991, and here we have a document from 2008. Over 17 years, we see a reiteration of this central myth about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This is that the United States serves as an honest broker between the two sides. In this book, I argue that over decades, the United States has acted in a thoroughly one-sided fashion regarding the Palestinians. In consequence, it has exacerbated and prolonged a conflict which, according to another myth, is between two near equals. We have the Palestinians, we have the Israelis. That is a myth, because a further myth would have it that if one party is the victim, if one party suffers the most, it is Israelis. In fact, this is a conflict between a powerful, dominant Israeli state, supported extensively by the United States, and a divided, oppressed Palestinian people, either living under occupation or dispersed in exile from their homeland. Now, I argue in this book, I begin with an epigraph from George Orwell. And I argue in this book that language has great importance in the construction of these kinds of myths. Orwell wrote in 1946 in a brilliant essay, and I quote, "The slovenliness of our language makes it easier for us to have foolish thoughts. If thought corrupts language, language can also corrupt thought." This is precisely what has happened with regard to this conflict. Framing it in terms, using terms like honest broker or peace process, in my view, has masked a bitter reality, which is one of U.S. complicity in the continued dominance of the Israeli state over the Palestinians. For decades, I'm arguing here, this process has in fact made the prospect of a just settlement of the conflict between these two sides, not just between the Palestinians and the Israelis, but between Israel and all of the Arab countries, much, much harder. And distortion of language has contributed crucially by corrupting thought and thereby cloaking the real nature of this outcome. What I show in this book is that, in fact, our policies, American policies, have been thoroughly entwined with those of Israel for many, many years. The high degree of complicity between the two countries on this issue, on the Palestine issue in particular, was grounded in a secret 1975 letter from President Ford to Prime Minister Rabin, whereby the United States agreed to, and I'm now quoting this secret letter, which is available in the American archives and the Israeli archives in public. The United States agreed to, I quote, "coordinate with Israel with a view to refraining from putting forth proposals that Israel would consider unsatisfactory." This has been translated into an Israeli veto over any American proposal that Israeli governments did not like, or the no daylight between the two countries, or the no surprises policy. You may have heard about this in the last presidential election, where one candidate, the Republican candidate, lambasted the president for allowing daylight to develop between the two countries. This actually goes back to a commitment made by President Ford. Logically, this complicity, which is grounded in an American commitment to Israel, should have disqualified the United States from playing the role of intermediary between the two antagonists. Of course, it did not. And at this point, I think it's essential to stress that having done these things over many decades in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, that is to say, having exacerbated the conflict, the United States, in fact, did help to resolve other aspects of the Arab-Israeli conflict via the Sinai and Golan disengagement agreements of 1974, 1975, via the Egyptian-Israeli part of the Camp David Accords of 1978, and via, most importantly, the peace treaty between Egypt and Israel, later the peace treaty between Jordan and Israel. In the 70s and 80s, these efforts were, of course, directed at achieving peace, but they were primarily directed at diffusing potential superpower conflict and at establishing American ascendancy in the Middle East in its Cold War rivalry with the Soviets. This is why Secretary Kissinger, Presidents Ford, and before him President Nixon, Secretary Vance, Dr. Brzezinski, and President Carter were so intent on these things. Of course, they were interested in peace. I'm not suggesting they weren't. But their main objective was a Cold War objective, a strategic objective. And that's why the United States was willing, in service of these vital objectives, to act forcefully and effectively. By way of contrast, there is no peace, as we have all noticed, between Palestinians and Israelis, in spite of 35 years of American initiatives which were supposedly directed at achieving such a peace under the Orwellian rubric of a peace process. Now, I suggest that the reasons for this unmitigated record of failure, 3.5 decades, a generation and a half, is illuminated by 3 moments of clarity in American policy on the Palestine question. And I really only focus on those 3. This is not a history of American policy in the Middle East. This is not a history of the Palestine question. It's simply a study of these 3 moments of clarity, which I think illuminate the whole story. The first of them came in the summer of 1982, at the end of the summer, when it appeared as if there might be an opportunity to implement the Palestinian autonomy provisions of the 1978 Camp David Accords. Some of you are old enough to remember that these accords were stillborn because Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin insisted on denying the Palestinians self-determination or control over land and water or an end to Israeli settlement expansion. In other words, he denied them any real autonomy. In 1982, in the wake of the Lebanon war, the ceasefire that had finally been brought about by Philip Habib, the Reagan administration perceived an opportunity to revive these autonomy accords. Washington, therefore, released, in the president's name, a peace plan on September 1st, 1982. Now, the memo I'm about to talk to you about was produced by an unnamed CIA analyst in the immediate run-up to the release of the Reagan Plan. And what he was asked to do, obviously, all the bits of it are redacted in the document, but what he was asked to do was say, how do you expect the president's plan is going to be received? And what he said was that Begin would react to any attempt by the United States to reframe the Palestinian autonomy provisions of the Camp David Accords by refusing to budge from the Prime Minister's own narrow, reductive interpretation. The memo stated that in Begin's view, the accords, and here I'm quoting this unnamed analyst, the accords guarantee that under no condition can a Palestinian state be created. The memo goes on. In practice, Begin effectively rules out any exercise of Palestinian self-determination, except one that continued Israel's preeminent position in the West Bank. Think about the language here. Self-determination that continues Israel's preeminent position in the West Bank. And I quote the memo at great length because I think it not only describes Begin's position, it describes what has become very firmly the Israeli position on this issue and the American position and the outlines of the accords that were finally signed in the 90s and are the basis of the status quo today. I think as revealing as this CIA memo of Israeli views is the fact that the president was unable to hold firm to the positions he publicly enunciated on September 1st in the face of Begin's refusal to budge. This was not the first time, nor was it the last, that American policymakers were to acquiesce in the Israeli position on Palestine. The second set of events that I examine in this book took place during these negotiations I was a part of here in Washington following the Madrid Peace Conference in October 1991. The confidential documents that were produced by the Palestinian delegation to which I had access, and some of which I actually reproduce on the Institute for Palestine Studies website. There are 15 of these documents. You can read them in full. They're memos of meetings with American and Israeli diplomats. There are Palestinian and Israeli proposals. There's a letter from Secretary Baker to Faisal Husseini. There's some interesting stuff in these documents. These documents expose the high degree of discrete coordination between the positions of the United States and Israel, along the lines of the memo the letter that President Ford sent to Prime Minister Rabin. They expose as well the timidity of U.S. diplomats in refusing to go beyond what they mistakenly believed were Israeli red lines. This reached the point of, to my way of thinking, absurdity, when the United States put forward what was called a bridging proposal in May 1993 that was less forthcoming than had been the last position that the Israelis communicated to the Palestinian side. In other words, the Americans were more Israeli than the Israelis in this instance. And I give you one of the documents is a memo where Palestinian negotiators sit there with the Americans and say, I mean, this is all Israeli substance you're giving us. In fact, the Israelis have gone beyond this. I wasn't terribly surprised to see in documents that were leaked from the 2006 negotiations a similar case of American mediators, so-called, taking positions that were more strident than even the Israelis. Another feature that emerges during this 1991-93 period, which is the second moment I examine in this book, this chapter 2, was the remarkable continuity in the Israeli position on Palestinian autonomy, on what would be allowed to the Palestinians, and what was produced in the end at Oslo in negotiations that took place, as it were, behind our backs while we were sitting here in Washington. In essence, this Israeli position remained unchanged from the days of Begin to those of Rabin, in spite of the fact that Rabin clearly made a major shift in accepting to negotiate directly with the PLO and accepting that the PLO represented the Palestinian people and accepting that there was such a thing as a Palestinian people, which no Israeli prime minister had ever done before. I argue in the book that until today, the core positions of every subsequent Israeli government has not changed in opposing genuine Palestinian independence. And if you want to ask me what I mean by this, I'll explain it in question and answer. Or ending Israel's effective control over and colonization of most of the West Bank and East Jerusalem. These confidential documents don't only reveal this continuity in the Israeli position, they also reveal the acquiescence of U.S. policymakers in these Israeli positions over a number of decades. So that's the second moment that I examine. The third is one that should be familiar to even the youngest of you here, and this is what happened during the last 2 years of President Obama's first administration, when the president faced relentless pressure from the Israeli prime minister, acting in concert with the Republicans in Congress and with the potent lobby that supports Israel in this town. I love Washington. It's called a town. Anyway, this city, this world capital, whatever. This pressure from three directions forced the president into humiliating retreats from positions on a settlement freeze, on the borders between two states that should the basis for those borders, and on the urgent need for a Palestinian state, which he'd staked out in his first 2 years in office. These were, not surprisingly, positions that had been taken previously by a succession of U.S. presidents, but Obama was obliged to abandon them in the last 2 years of his first administration. And as we all remember, it wasn't Palestine that he ended up talking about, it was rather Iran, Prime Minister Netanyahu's preferred subject. And that is the subject that's predominated in exchanges between the two governments ever since, as the Israeli Prime Minister wishes. I argue that these three moments of clarity provide a clear sense of American policies which you just don't hear described in op-eds or in much of the other writing on this subject. Instead, we get a lot of fluff. We get corrupt, deceitful language, which I think has played a crucial role in obscuring things. For decades, this mantra, which we keep hearing about a peace process, has in fact concealed the fact that whatever process the United States was actually championing, it was not directed at achieving a just and lasting peace between Palestinians and Israelis, something that actually met the basic desiderata of both sides. A just peace that would bring this conflict to a conclusion on a fair basis would look quite different from the ends that this country has pursued for many decades. I would argue that such a peace would have to involve a complete and immediate dismantling of the entire 46-year-old Israeli military occupation structure, what Amir Haas calls the matrix of control that's been established over the Palestinians and which is invisible to us. We see Palestinian violence. We don't see 46 years of every child for 3 generations or 2.5 generations growing up under this. It would involve an end to the colonization of Palestinian land, this enterprise that is ongoing with the force of a bulldozer. And it would involve self-determination for the Palestinians within equitable borders, not just whatever Bantustan, gerrymandered 15th Congressional District style outline happens to please Israeli settlement builders, but a set of equitable borders. And finally, it would involve a just resolution for Palestinians who were made refugees in 48 or 67. Instead of actually trying to achieve these goals, end the occupation, stop this settlement process, and figure out how to solve the refugee issue, I think that the process that the United States was engaged in was aimed at pressuring the Palestinians into conforming to the wishes of the oppressor, the occupier. And the book is replete with references to documents. You can dig it further if you're interested than I was able to, which show that this was the case. And it's very clear what Israel's aims have been. This was certainly these were certainly the aims of Prime Minister Begin. He had an ideal having to do with the idea that there was a greater land of Israel, that there was one people with rights in that land, the Jewish people, and that everything had to be fitted into that template. On that basis, he intended to maintain permanent effective control of Jerusalem and the West Bank. He intended to, therefore he intended to prevent the Palestinians from achieving real statehood and genuine self-determination. In my view, very mistakenly, when the PLO accepted the Oslo Accords in the summer of 1993 that were signed on the White House lawn in September of that year, it in effect accepted a deal along lines that were almost crafted without exception by Menachem Begin. What he sets down in notes that I quote, that he used at Camp David in '78, what is described by the CIA analyst in this 1982 memo, is pretty much the Palestinian Authority as it has emerged. There, in almost no significant respect, except with regard to Jerusalem, in one minor respect, does it differ from that. And forcing the Palestinians to conform to that, as I've suggested, has been a major American aim. Another objective of American policy was to avoid differences on this hot-button issue, which really concerns Israelis in ways that some other issues that the United States has forced Israel to go along with do not. The book shows that the core dynamics of U.S. policymaking on Palestine, in which domestic political calculations have been paramount, have actually been quite stable since the Truman administration. What we have done, what our country has done, was at best, if you want to be charitable, conflict management. It was not conflict resolution. In fact, I would argue it was conflict perpetuation. By contrast, and I show this in the book, where serious strategic considerations were at play, especially during the Cold War, domestic political factors, Israeli opposition was much less important. During the Cold War, the United States repeatedly overruled vociferous Israeli objections to achieve advantage over the Soviet Union, to force through deals that Israeli leaders did not want. They did so because of the advantages that were accrued to the United States. In effect, by winning over Egypt in the 70s, the United States won the Cold War in the Middle East. And for American policymakers, that was a huge prize. Similarly, where big economic interests, the oil lobby, defense industries, aerospace are concerned with big arms sales to Gulf oil producers, you see very little difficulty in pushing those kinds of things through. By way of contrast, given the short-sighted belief in Washington that no major American strategic interests are involved where Palestine is concerned, U.S. policy on this issue has been made almost exclusively with an eye to domestic political factors. I want to say a few words about the Arab countries before I open up to questions. In my view, the role of the Arab states, the Arab governments, can be compared to Sherlock Holmes's dog that did not bark. There's this image of the Arabs having huge lobby and enormous capacity to affect outcomes. In fact, Saudi Arabia, which is the central pillar of American policy in the Arab world and has been since 1933, when the first oil deal was signed that created Aramco, Saudi Arabia has played a very equivocal role where Palestine was concerned. I would say that's actually true of most Arab governments. While the kingdom has paid public lip service to the Palestine cause, in private, Saudi diplomacy has taken a very, very different tack. In spite of written promises in a letter from President Roosevelt to Ibn Saud in April of 1945, in which he said that the United States would consult with the Arabs over Palestine and would do nothing that would harm Arab interests there. That's almost the exact wording of the president's letter. Decades of American policy have involved betrayals of these promises and brought no significant reaction from the Saudis. Truman and his successors were able to ignore President Roosevelt's pledges of 1945 without fear of losing all the advantages of the American-Saudi relationship. Saudi dissatisfaction was so muted that Secretary of State Marshall in 1948 wrote to thank the king for his, quote, conciliatory manner. This is in the Foreign Relations of the United States, this letter, regarding Palestine. It's clear that ties with Washington are far more important to most Arab governments than their proclaimed attachment to the Palestine cause. And I think what we have to conclude is that U.S. alliances with these Arab Gulf monarchies and with Israel are in fact not contradictory. They're complementary. There is no Arab lobby in terms of these states where this issue, the Palestine issue, is concerned. Even the oil embargo after the '73 war didn't change this basic equation. Henry Kissinger wrote of this embargo, I'm quoting Kissinger now from his memoirs, the rhetoric of Saudi diplomats on behalf of the Arab cause was impeccable and occasionally intransigent, but behind the scenes, Saudi policy was almost always helpful to American diplomacy. I think this pattern explains why it's not only the Israel lobby that drives U.S. Middle East policy. In fact, there's no contradiction between the strategic interests involved in aligning with the Arab oil-producing monarchies and U.S. support for Israel. As a result, the short-term cost of that support is very small, and in Washington, nobody thinks of anything but the short term. So there you are. Let me say one last thing about the Arab world, because everybody knows that public opinion in the Arab world is very pro-Palestinian. But everybody also knows that most Arab states are not and have not been democracies. And everybody knows, or should know, that the rulers of many of these states are very dependent on American favor. In consequence, the United States has been able to ignore Arab public opinion. If, this is an enormous if fundamental and lasting democratization takes place in the Arab world, if stable democratic regimes emerge from the turmoil there in 5 or 7 or 10 years, I would argue that the United States is not going to be able to continue this shell game. It'll be impossible to get away with some of the things the United States is doing, because there will now be vital strategic interests that Arab governments are going to push. They're going to say, we really think this is important. It's not just our public opinion. We have to do what our people say. If you want to see an example of how a change can take place on a different issue, look at what the change of government in Turkey did when the United States invaded Iraq and wanted to use Turkish territory to move troops. Turkish government was willing. Turkish army was willing. Turkish parliament wasn't willing. Didn't happen. That's a case where a country that democratized suddenly a government had to pay attention to its people. That's not the case in most countries in the Arab world. A distorted set of American priorities has helped to produce a broad range of intractable outcomes in Palestine. One of them has been the increase since 1990 in the Israeli settler population. It's grown in Arab East Jerusalem and the West Bank from about 200,000 people in 1990 to nearly 600,000 people today. Settlers now constitute 1 in 10 of Jewish Israelis, nearly 1 in 10 of Jewish Israeli voters. And Israel is a democracy, and so that counts. These and other facts on the ground didn't just happen spontaneously. Those settlements are not mushrooms. Israeli planners scientifically placed them where they are in order to make a two-state solution impossible. When you talk about settlement blocks, you talk about why a contiguous viable Palestinian state is not possible. You don't just talk about Israelis living in their homes. It's a much more complicated situation than that. These settlements and the rigid matrix of control over the people of the occupied territories, the 4 million people who have lived for 46 years, in June it'll become 46 years, under military occupation with essentially no rights. These facts on the ground now constitute, I would argue, insuperable obstacles to the prospect of a two-state solution. That's what they were meant to do, the settlements, and they have succeeded. This is not just a result of U.S. inaction. Our country has been actively involved in crafting this situation. Policymakers don't want to think about it. Politicians who vote U.S. aid don't want to believe it, but we have helped to produce this situation on the ground in Palestine through $3 billion in annual military aid, $115 billion in aid to Israel since the beginning, most of it since 1973, hundreds of millions of dollars annually in tax-free dollars that flow to some of the most violent fundamentalist terrorists in the Middle East, that is to say, the settlers. Our tax dollars, that's not our tax dollars, that's tax-free donations from 501c3s, fund a very large proportion of settlement activity. Finally, our diplomacy works assiduously to protect these egregious violations of international law. It's not our inaction, it's our action that has helped to create this situation. These realities are screened from the American public. I promise you, you don't hear what I'm saying on most of the networks. I promise you, you don't hear what I'm saying on most of the cable news, quote-unquote, channels. We're told that there's a process of negotiation between near equals under the impartial gaze of an honest American broker. We're told that this is supposed to create an independent Palestinian state, but that is not what is actually happening. What is actually happening is that the dispersal, the occupation, and the colonization of the Palestinians is continuing apace. In the words of someone who should know, someone who participated in this charade, Aaron David Miller, what the United States is doing is not operating as an honest broker, it's operating as Israel's lawyer. That's Miller's term, not my term. And he didn't make it up, he borrowed it from Henry Kissinger, who God knows should know. So what I'm saying is that a number of patterns have contributed to this skewed, biased, unbalanced American position. There was no real pressure on the United States from the Arab countries. Far from it. There was an exaggerated attention by politicians and policymakers to domestic political concerns, as these were ably articulated by the Israel lobby. And in spite of occasional sympathetic, and I believe most cases sincere noises from American leaders like President Carter or President Obama, Secretary of State Vance or Secretary of State Baker, at the end of the day, American policy actually did not work in favor of either the national or the human rights of the Palestinians. This meant that while Israeli governments usually got what they wanted on the Palestine issue, a peaceful and just resolution of this conflict was not the result of our government's actions. In fact, I think as a result of our government's actions and many other factors, Palestinian incompetence, many, many other factors, Israeli policy, Arab complacence, we are much farther from any kind of resolution of this conflict than we were when we went to Madrid in '91. In consequence, as I'm arguing here, our policy has not served our long-term national interest. That interest would be served by a just and lasting resolution of this conflict. Our policy hasn't served the interest of international peace and stability, and it hasn't served the interest of these peoples, the Palestinians, the Israelis, other Arab peoples. It has taken an enormous amount of what George Orwell called corrupt language to conceal these ugly realities. Thank you very much. Go ahead. If anybody needs to leave, this is your moment. However you want to get to the mics. Sir, you're already there.
Yes.
Go for it.
My daughter enjoyed your course so much at Columbia last fall. She's now majoring in Middle East Studies, and
Oh
I'm
my
not
God,
sure
I'm responsible
if I
for
should
that?
thank you for that or curse you.
Is that a sarcastic thank you?
She loves it. And I don't know if you can answer this, but have you seen The Gatekeepers?
Oh, yes. Yes.
I
Yes.
watched
The question was, have I seen the movie The Gatekeepers?
I watched the film on Monday evening with a former U.S. National Security Advisor who thought this would be a real wake-up call to the Israeli public. Your comments.
It is a superb film. The movie is The Gatekeepers, nominated for an Academy Award this year. Didn't get it, unfortunately. Together with another film also nominated for an Academy Award, another full-length documentary, 5 Broken Cameras, made by a Palestinian with Israeli producer. I think these two movies cannot be seen by anybody without it changing their view of the entire conflict. 6 former heads of the General Security Service, the Shabak, the Shin Bet, in this movie say many of the things I just said. But they're former Israeli security chiefs. They're the men who were responsible for running the Palestinians' lives for the last several decades. It's a remarkable film. 5 Broken Cameras is even more painful to watch. There's another great film called The Law in These Parts about Israeli military justice. You should see all 3 of them. If you're really interested in this conflict, they're well worth seeing. Yes, ma'am. The next question, it may be over here. Yes, ma'am.
Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
3 parts. Number 1,
Should I take notes
would you
here?
please? Yes, please. Would you comment as to why we never hear any of this set of facts in the American media? Number 1.
Mm-hmm.
Number 2, you say that we haven't considered it strategically vital interests in why we are conducting our foreign policy this way. I would contend, and I bet you do too, that in fact we have suffered immeasurably by this point of view, and I'd like to have you comment on how.
Mm-hmm.
And number 3, given that we seem to be following this perspective all along, what's going to happen in Iran? Are we actually going to attack Iran, which is the goal of the Israeli government at this point? Thank you.
Okay, let me answer them in reverse order. I do not believe we are going to attack Iran, and I don't believe Israel is going to attack Iran. I hope I'm right. I mean, I'm a historian. I talk about the past. I shouldn't be trying to predict the future. But I have great faith in many respects in our intelligence community and in our defense establishment and in our diplomats. The people who, give them their orders don't always know what they're doing at the top. But these people have a pretty good sense of a lot of stuff. And they believe and have expressed this to, and it seems now 2 presidents, that the United States going to war with Iran or allowing itself to be dragged into a war with Iran by Israel would be suicidal folly. I agree with them. And I think that President George W. Bush, in his last term in office, came to the same conclusion when he was being pressured by the vice president and others to give Israel the wherewithal to launch a war that the United States would inevitably have been drawn into. And this president was told the same thing. The amusing thing about this, if one reads the Israeli press, is that the Israeli security establishment feels exactly the same way as our top military and intelligence and diplomatic people. They understand perfectly well, A, that the threat that Benjamin Netanyahu has been talking about for 18 or 20 years is not, in fact, of the dimensions that he describes it. You should go back and read his warnings 15 years ago about Iran tomorrow will be doing X, Y, and Z. So I hope and pray that we will not end up in a war with Iran. I think it really would be suicidal folly. This is an enormous problem to deal with, but war would create problems that would make the problems that we face today look like child's play. Vital strategic interests, have we suffered? Of course. It's in the strategic interest of the United States. Of course we've suffered. We've suffered enormously from this. We've suffered from the disdain and contempt of the entire world for the apparent foolishness of our policy. You can go anywhere in the world. You don't have to go to the Arab world. You don't have to go to the Middle East. You don't have to go to those weird Arabs and Muslims. You know, go to French people or Danes or Peruvians or Mozambicans. They think our policy is completely irrational. Why are you doing this? I mean, you support Israel, fine, but to this degree? So everybody, I mean, disdain is fine. But strategically, I don't think people like former Secretary Gates or former Chairman of the Joint Chiefs Mullen or General Petraeus, when he was still in the military, were thinking of, people don't like us. They were thinking of the strategic consequences of this bias when they said what they said, criticizing it. So yes, of course we've suffered. Of course we suffered. The problem is, as I said in my talk, this is a long-term issue. It's very hard to point to this policy of ours led to that result and tomorrow will cause us this problem. It's always something that can be pushed off. It's always something that the cottage industry in Washington, which consists in saying nobody cares about the Palestinians, it's not important, everything else in the Middle East is much more important. They seem to do very well in pushing that line. And in shutting up everybody who knows better within our government, who are intimidated into keeping their mouths shut. And you hear from them when they retire how strongly they disagreed. I've heard a lot from many people who feel that way. The media. Well, it's not just the media. I think the first thing we have to understand is that there's a general cultural bias in this country, or general cultural predisposition, I think is a better way of saying it, which sees Israel in an entirely positive light for reasons that have to do with religion and shared values and a whole bunch of other things, some of which are illusory and some of which are very real. And there's family connections that are deep between many people in Israel, and so on and so forth. I could go on and on because I really think that's the bedrock of this. Against that, you have to say that there's no countervailing narrative in this country. I mean, there's nobody who's put the Palestinian narrative before Americans. How many people in this room have seen the film Exodus or read the book? Raise your hands. How many people in this room have read the book Exodus or seen the Paul Newman movie? Raise your hands very high. And look around. Okay, every one of you has been brainwashed. How many of you have seen a Palestinian movie? There is no Palestinian movie. There is no Palestinian narrative. Well, fine. A few of you may be, devotees of a certain kind of documentary movie where you've seen that. But I'm talking about the entire generation of people between, I don't know how old and how old, have a set of experiences about Arabs, Muslims, Palestinians in particular, ideas about terrorism and so forth, and on the other hand, ideas about Israel, which are the basis, the bedrock for the way in which the media approaches this. It's not just the news media. It's not just this dishonest language, which is the only language you can use, it sometimes seems, in op-eds and so forth. It goes well beyond that. It goes to a sort of whole set of cultural biases. My son is a playwright, and he has actor friends. And if they're Arabs or Middle Easterners or swarthy, they will tell you, you can't get a role as anything but a terrorist. It's literally the only role that's available if you have that look. They type you. Oh, we got lots of roles for you as terrorists. I mean, you can make a living on television as a terrorist if you have the right, the right mustache and the right, color. Well, that's what our culture is telling people about this region, and that's the problem with the media. Ma'am.
Okay. Well, comment. I read the Leon Uris book many years ago. I have gotten smarter in a number of ways since then. I have a specific question and a more general one. Right. I see you didn't include any comments on Bill Clinton's efforts to reach a settlement. I don't know
Right.
whether you think they were of no consequence, but it was the Palestinians who walked out. Second, I feel you're setting up a straw man, as they say. I don't know how many people think here that the U.S. is really an honest broker in the sense of being neutral between.
Israel
I
and the
mean,
Palestinians.
Yeah,
Okay.
I don't think so. It would be nice, but we're not. It doesn't mean. But on the other hand, and nor do we have much influence. The settlements thing, which has constantly upset me, clearly we've had no influence there.
Let me stop you there, because that sounds like getting onto a third question.
Well, okay, the general question is, why do you think we've even been an honest broker? And if not us, who? Because somebody ought to. Is there anyone else?
That is 3 questions.
Thank you.
That's okay. President Clinton. There is a bit about President Clinton in the book. I pared down a talk that went originally 40 minutes to 20 to 30 minutes. I think I stayed within 30 minutes. Did I? Yeah, that's what I tried to do. President Clinton, I think, made a sincere effort, but we are all, especially in Washington, for God's sakes, we're all connoisseurs of the presidential cycle. And we all know what a first term is, and we all know what a second term is, and we all know what a lame duck is, and we all know what somebody in the last 6 months of the second term of his presidency is. He's a dead duck. Now, if the president wanted to lay out the parameters for a Palestinian-Israeli final status regime, the time to have done it would have been first year, second year, third year, fourth year, fifth year, sixth year, even his 7th year, not the last few months of his 8th year. That's the first problem. The second problem is you actually have to go and do a little sort of archaeology into what was happening between the time the Madrid process started and the Oslo Accords were signed in 93, and what happened in 2000 when the president took the parties to Camp David. This process had run into the ground as far as Palestinians and Israelis were concerned. Sharon was about to win over Barak. The prime minister who went to Camp David was a prime minister who was even lamer and deader than the president. In the sense he'd already lost his majority in the Knesset. Who was he? What was he representing? What was Clinton representing? Arafat had similarly lost the support of his people because most Palestinians by 2000 had already concluded this was not a peace process that was going to lead to self-determination and statehood. This was a process that had worsened the occupation, decreased their GDP per capita, restricted their movement, and expanded the settlement enterprise. And he had already lost the confidence and the support that he had in the early 90s among his own people. So that's the real problem with Camp David, and the spinmeistering which both American and some American and some Israeli participants have engaged in. Most, by the way, of the accounts don't agree with that. Don't agree with either Dennis Ross or, with all due respect, the president or the Israeli prime minister. I mean, his foreign minister, you should read his account, Shlomo Ben-Ami. You should read Uri Savir's account. You should read the really good Israeli journalistic accounts. They don't agree with anything Barak said or that the president said. So that's what I would say about President Clinton, for all the effort that he did invest in this issue. Straw man. Yeah, you're right, actually. It is a straw man. I can't resist it because American diplomats keep saying it. But you're right. Of course the United States is not an honest broker, and most politicians in this country wouldn't stand for a moment for the United States being an honest broker. You're perfectly right. I should really have written the book in Arabic and printed it in Ramallah and have it sold, in the streets so that people there would rise up and say, we won't listen to the United States anymore. Don't come and talk to us. Send us a different party. And that brings me to your last question. If not us, who? Well, I mean, look, the United States is the 900-pound gorilla on the block in the Middle East. Ever since World War II, we really have been the dominant power. The Soviet Union challenged us. It lost. We won. And you can't really do anything there without the United States. That doesn't mean the United States should monopolize this process, as it has done since the 70s, because the United States is not fit to mediate, very simply. And there should be other actors. I would say that with the exception of a few South Sea Pacific islands, which vote with Israel and the United States on anything, any country on earth would be a better mediator. Literally, any country on earth would be a better mediator. It's not going to happen because nobody is willing to put their head into that meat grinder. You're going to have a real tussle with the United States if you try and displace it from its role as sole, exclusive, monopolistic mediator of this conflict. Ma'am.
Hello. I really appreciate your comment on language and the use of language, primarily, I guess, in the mainstream media. But I'd like for you to address a different aspect of language. Those of us who've been involved with this issue for decades, hard to believe, have seen, at least some of us think we have seen a shift in the discourse. There was a conference in town in conjunction with the APAC convention recently where people like Phyllis Bennis spoke about the shift in discourse over the past 10 or so years. Not that there's been, of course, a shift in policy, but a shift in discourse that's very important to acknowledge and to build on, in conjunction with the BDS movement, in conjunction with things like 5 Broken Cameras being produced.
Being produced and nominated for an Academy Award and seen in mainstream cinemas. I mean,
but so could you address what I hear you saying versus that what I think is a real shift in discourse?
I mean, I make this a very short answer. I agree fully with Phyllis Bennis and whoever said that, and I agree with you. I've seen the shift in the discourse. When I was an undergraduate, the word Palestine was an epithet. I mean, if you said it, if you uttered it, you were something of you were almost a Nazi. Okay, to say it was to, as people took it, Palestine, Palestinian, whatever, was to deny the right of the Jewish people to exist. Okay, I'm exaggerating only slightly. You couldn't use that term in polite conversation. There are circles to this day where you can't, but that has changed. Even the mainstream media, the much reviled, the legitimately reviled mainstream media, even the mainstream media has changed, I think, in many respects on this issue. And there are other media. Let me tell you something. I have a class, the class that your son took. Daughter. Sorry, excuse me. Your daughter took, which has between 160 and 200 students per year. And, you know, I've been teaching for almost 40 years, and I can read an audience. It's my job. I know how when they're awake, when they're asleep, when they're, you know, buying handbags online, and when they're actually taking notes. I sort of know what they're doing. And I know that they don't read the mainstream or pay any attention to the mainstream media. And I know that because when I mentioned what I read that morning in the New York Times, maybe 8 heads in 150 will nod. When I mention what Jon Stewart said skewering the mainstream media, they're laughing before I get to the punchline because they've already seen it on their laptops. They don't watch television, heaven forbid that. They don't own televisions. They probably wouldn't know how to turn on a television. They may remember from when they were kids. But they see all this stuff online. So they have other means. So the media is not the mainstream media anymore. Maybe for this generation, most of you, it is. But for them, people in their 20s and their teens, God knows, it's not. So there and I can tell you about other spheres in which there has been a change in the discourse. So yes, there has. But we have an impenetrable political level, which has as yet been completely unaffected by this, in my view. Yes, sir.
We've talked about the Israelis and the U.S. negotiators. What about the Palestinians? I mean, they obviously create the impression that they're participating, and most of the time the system blames them for failures in negotiations.
Right.
What, given this collusion that they faced, and they obviously knew the game was fixed, what options did they have other than what they did?
Yeah,
and
that's a very good question. Let me answer that. You've actually asked 2 questions, or 3, and they're good ones. I actually talk about this a little bit in the book. I have another book which I saw you have up there, The Iron Cage, where I talk about Palestinian failures over many generations, in fact. Failures in the 30s, failures in the 40s, up to and including some of the failures in Oslo and before and afterwards. I think the Palestinians have suffered from appallingly bad leadership for most of their modern history. In contrast to the Israelis, Israel had a lot of advantages. The Zionist movement had a lot of advantages, but had some really inspired leadership. Very, very gifted people. The Palestinians had a couple of them, but not enough, given the disadvantages, the material disadvantages they faced. And unlike Israeli leaders, the Palestinians have been subject to systematic elimination by assassination or imprisonment. And so you have a little problem with Palestinian leadership that most of the good ones are either dead or in prison. Nevertheless, there has been a dearth of leadership. And Palestinian performance, in my view, in most of the negotiations so far, including, this is a self-criticism, some of the negotiations I was involved in, was subpar. at the very least. I would actually be much more critical if I didn't have some inhibitions. In some cases, it was appalling. And what the Palestinians could have done, well, in 1991, when we found that the United States was not keeping the commitments we understood it to have made in the letter of assurances, the delegation recommended to the PLO leadership that they should, if the United States wouldn't do anything, say, you have invited us to this negotiation on false pretenses, we can't participate. And the PLO in Tunis refused that advice. Now, I'm not sure that pulling out was the right thing to do, but if you're told we're going to do this and we promise that, or we will avoid that, or we will do this and that and the other, and the party that's organizing the party that's organizing the event doesn't live up to its commitments, then some kind of conclusion should be drawn. Unfortunately, ever since that day, I don't think, certainly the PLO leadership, certainly the leadership in Ramallah, has drawn that conclusion. So Palestinian leadership has done a very poor job. The Palestinian leadership has done a very poor job, in my view. What I would also say is that allowing the division in Palestinian ranks that has divided the Palestinian national movement to persist in the face of an infinitely stronger enemy is criminal malfeasance on the part of both parties. Whatever the United States wants or Israel wants, whatever Iran wants, whatever outside actors want, it is an overwhelming Palestinian national interest that the Palestinians get their act together, unify their national movement, and have a single strategy. I mean, against an infinitely more powerful opponent. However they want to decide what that strategy is, and they haven't done that, and that's a tragedy, and in my view, it's almost a crime on their part. Can't blame anybody else but the Palestinians for that. I talk about some of this in this book. Yes, sir.
You mentioned as a goal a Palestinian state with continuous, equitable, non-gerrymandered borders. How does Gaza fit into that?
Well, you have to have some kind of guaranteed connection between the two. There are ways it could be done. I've seen plans for it. I would argue that we're long beyond the point where a two-state solution is possible. This country is partly responsible for that. Israeli policymakers are responsible. I think the Arab countries are responsible for that, and the Palestinians are. But if you were to want to reverse the clock and undo, Tony Judd, the late Tony Judd once said, what any politician has done, another politician can undo. So if many decades of Israeli policy, supported and financed by us, are going to be reversed, and you actually dismantle the matrix of control, you actually dismantle the occupation, you actually remove settlements that were placed so that there cannot be contiguity, then you'd still have, as you correctly point out, the problem of Gaza. And there are ways of doing it. I mean, we have subways and you have metros in New York City. I mean, that's one way of doing it. The distance is much less than from, I don't know, where I live, 110th Street, to Brooklyn, to Bay Ridge. That wouldn't be very difficult to do. So there would be ways of doing it. I think if there were a will, there would be a way. I just don't think there's a will. Ma'am.
You are the historian. I can be the historian only by virtue of my age and the fact that I was born in Palestine and grew up in Israel.
Mm-hmm.
So, I think that I'm familiar with your work, not with this one. Mm-hmm. And I thought your analysis of the two societies is rather interesting and possibly contributes to the failure of the hope for Palestinian state as much as U.S. policy. However, the history of the conflict did not start in 1967 with the settlements. Between
That's correct.
Between 1948 and 1967, there were almost 20 years without settlements. And perhaps
or occupation.
Occupation. Well, settlements and occupation are the same thing. And I'm not pro-settlements, God forbid. But what happened at that time between these three partners, Israel, the United States, and the Palestinians, besides the facts that the Palestinians perhaps were somewhat asleep and the consciousness was raised really under oppression.
Right.
Just like the Jewish consciousness was raised under oppression.
Right.
But what happened during those years?
That's a good question. Actually, I focus on some aspects of that in the book I just mentioned, The Iron Cage. And the Palestinians disappear from the political map, exactly as you said. They weren't asleep. Palestinian society was devastated by the 1948 war. A majority of Palestinians were made homeless in the 1948 war. Most Palestinian property was lost during the 1948 war. The overwhelming majority of the urban population of Palestine, which is where the leadership, the industries, the banks, the human capital was dispersed. There were over 60,000 Arabs in Jaffa. There were over 60,000 Arabs in Haifa. There were over 60,000 Arabs in Jerusalem. 120,000 of the first two cities and 30,000 in Jerusalem were driven out of their homes in 1948. So urban society, I mean, think of a society which is largely agrarian, but where much of the nerve centers are in the cities. And that's what happened to Palestinian society. In addition to which, more than half of the people were uprooted from their homes and were never allowed back. So you had a society that suffered a societal trauma and was politically absent. I mean, the only place that the word Palestine was uttered in those years between 48 and 67 was the United Nations and the Arab League. And another thing that's worth talking about is that we don't need to call it a conspiracy, but the powers that were not willing to see the Palestinians take their place in 1948 did not just include the Israelis. The United States and the Soviet Union were equally supportive of Israel and uninterested in a Palestinian state being created. The partition resolution called for an Arab state. It called for the majority to get less than half of the country, but it did call for an Arab state. That state was strangled in its cradle, not just by Israel, also by Jordan and by Britain, by bilateral deals that these three powers did with one another. These are Israeli historians that dug most of this stuff up, and I quote it in this book. But that's what happened to the Palestinians. And when they emerge on the scene in the 60s, it's as if they're rising from a long sleep. They weren't asleep. I mean, you can read novelists like Ghassan Kanafani to see what was actually going on, or Mahmoud Darwish, or any number of great Palestinian literary figures, all of them since gone now, but their work is there to understand what the Palestinians were actually, or Emil Habibi, or I mean, there's a bunch of them, and translated into English, and most of them into Hebrew, actually.
We're just about out of time.
So I'll take two questions and I'll answer them together. So you ma'am, and you sir, but you first, please.
Me.
You and then him, and that's it. I'm told we have to shut it down.
How
so.
do you make this lower?
No, I can't help you with that. Someone next to you. There you go. I think you just did it.
I've heard you saying you're a historian and you are involved in analyzing the past, but
Yeah.
based on the past and the present, would you be kind enough to sketch 3 scenarios for us as to how things are going to develop in the next 15 years, 30 years, 50 years from now? And because you are much more knowledgeable than any of us here.
Well,
Thank you.
I'm not sure about that. Sir, I'll answer them both, but after I've heard them both. Please.
You've indicated that a two-state solution really isn't possible anymore.
Yeah.
But what would you advise this administration to do? What sort of course of action should they undertake? They clearly want to do something about this problem.
Yeah. Okay. That's a very good question. I actually don't think the situation today is propitious for a resolution, one way or another, any positive resolution. But let me start. Any approach to a solution, I think, has to start with an analysis of where we are. What state are we in right now? Whether you're talking about, I don't know where the lady who asked me the question is. You're right here. I don't know whether you want to you want to talk about what this administration might do in the next year or two, or you want to talk about how things might go in 15 or 30 years. But you have to start with where we are today. And I would argue that where we are today is some kind of a bastard one-state solution. It's a de facto result of actions taken by a number of parties. There is one sovereign entity between the river and the sea. There is one state, real state. There is one country that has complete, absolute, and utter control over the entire territory of what used to be called Mandatory Palestine, Israel and the occupied territories. And that state has done a variety of things, and the Palestinians have done a variety of things. The United States has done a variety of things. The Arab states have done a variety of things that have created this outcome. And I think that any policymaker or anybody who wants to predict the future has to say, how is this going to evolve, or how do we want it to evolve? And with all due respect, if you take the president's speech in Jerusalem, I don't think that speech takes us away from the status quo, with all due respect. I think that you have to argue against certain well-established notions about the status quo. I think you have to accept these realities, say this is what we have, and say if we want a two-state solution, we need to do X, Y, and Z. We need to stop funding the settlement enterprise. Okay, Israeli governments are completely independent. They have rejected American advice on settlements since Menachem Begin. Fine. Do we control our own tax dollars or not? Well, that's an argument I think we should have in the United States and tell everybody else to butt out. This is an American argument over whether X charity is really a 501c3 engaged in charitable activities or whether it's funding illegal, violent settlers in the occupied territories. Are our weapons meeting U.S. law when they're used in Gaza or when they're used here or when they're used there? I mean, those are American purposes that an American president can say, fine, you don't want to take our advice? You're a proud, free, independent people realizing the Jewish Zionist dream, whatever. He can lard it on as much as he wants, but we're not going to fund it because it goes counter to our interests and our policies. You'd have to have a fight to do some of those things. If you don't want to do that, then say what I think American policymakers would never say, but should say. We have a situation which will never lead to a two-state solution. A lot of people are being oppressed. There's nothing we can do about it. We have bigger fish to fry. Leave us alone. And we're going to fund it. And by God, we'll defend it in the General Assembly and the Security Council if anybody challenges this status quo. That's the real situation. You'd have to turn around a lot of things domestically, which means a president has to get up on a bully pulpit and argue against a very fixed set of political opinions and opinions in the media and in this infernal circle of think tanks that surround our policymakers with ideas by people who couldn't find their way from the airport to the Hilton in any capital in the Arab world without a minder, but are experts. So we have extraordinary expertise in our government. I've taught some of them, for God's sakes. I know how smart some of them are, up and down the ranks of our government. I met many of them, especially some of them who've left government service. I'm not saying the president should listen to whatever the experts say, but don't allow them to be penalized or badgered or pressured if they give him honest advice. And then say what's politically doable and not doable. That's for a president to decide. What can be done with Congress, God knows what can be done with Congress. That's another issue. But I think things could be done. Let me try and answer your question, because that's I don't know what we're going to have. I would say in the very short term, we're going to have an extension to the future of the status quo I just sketched out. There is one state. There's going to continue to be one state. The question is, and it's one state with several categories of citizenship and non-citizenship, several categories of rights and deprivation of rights. If that situation continues into the indefinite future, I don't think it's sustainable in American terms or European terms, and it can't continue without American and European support. Israel is an independent and a powerful country, a nuclear power, huge military, fantastic technological advances, yada, 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 but it can't operate outside of that American-European sphere, technologically, intellectually. I mean, stop Israeli academics from coming to the United States, and you have a revolt on your hand at Ben Gurion, Tel Aviv, and Hebrew University. They're coming and going. That depends on everybody closing their eyes to the fact that there are people with absolutely no rights for 2.5 generations under Israeli rule with American support. Now, nobody talks about that in those terms. We are underwriting a system of systematic oppression for 2.5 decades. The deprivation of rights of people who were expelled from their homes way back when, because as the questioner here, the lady here said, this is not a 1967 problem. There are problems that go back to 1948. She's right. She lived there. She knows what she's talking about. We've underwritten that too, and we're responsible for it in part. So that's what we're going to have, I'm afraid, for the foreseeable future, for reasons we all know. What Israeli politics are like, the fecklessness and division within Palestinian ranks, the mess in the Arab world. How could that change? I don't know how it could change. I said one thing in my talk. The rest of the world has undergone processes of democratization that have changed. I lived in Korea for 3 years. My father worked for the UN under Park Chung-hee. His daughter is an elected president of Korea, one of a series of elected presidents. It was a jackboot military dictatorship. It's now a democracy. All over East Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, Latin America, Eastern Europe, hideous dictatorships have been transformed with reverses and backwards and forwards. The only region that has been, even in Africa, there are more democracies percentage-wise than in the Arab world. And there are reasons for that. I could talk about that, but we have no more time. Next time. That's another book, actually. You just gave me an idea. I think that's going to change. It's not going to change easily. This is a region which, since Alexander, since the pharaohs, has attracted external intervention. And that complicates things in ways that, frankly, with all due respect to Taiwan, is not entirely is the case, or Peru, or whatever. This is the Middle East. It's the most important region strategically in world history. And then on top of that, you have oil. Okay? So you have 2 layers of supreme importance to everybody. That means a lot of people put their noses in it.
What about water? I heard one time the problem is...
That's another question, man. You can come and ask me that later. I think I better stop. Thank you
You know, Rashid told me before we began that he remembered from his previous visits that the audiences at Politics and Prose ask very good questions. Thank you for living up to your reputation. Now fold up your seats, buy his book, and he'll be up here to sign it.
Yep. Thank you so much for doing this. I told you.
I heard you telling Kathy Kay speaking on BBC News. I thought you were being courteous to her.